Welcome back. This is week 4, lecture 2, Human Rights, Reason, and the Enlightenment. In the previous lecture, in the discussion of Newton, I quoted from and gave the quote on this PowerPoint slide of Alexander Pope, an English poet and author and Enlightenment thinker, who wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hidden night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." End quote. Now, in that short little phrase or couplet or whatever you want to call it, and it really encapsulates a lot of that which has been referred to as the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is a term that was used at the time. There's an awareness of being enlightened. We need to bring about an enlightenment. In some ways, similar to the Reformation, which I referred to back in the earlier lectures, talking about the medieval world and the Reformation, how the term Reformation was a term used at the time, and that I focused on that historical use rather than what scholars have made out of it. And in so many ways, the Enlightenment is similar in that the understanding of the enlightened thinkers, the thinkers of the Enlightenment, is not necessarily always identical with how scholars have later portrayed them. This is particularly true with the issue of faith and reason. Now, I talked about faith and reason before. I'll be talking about it again because so often this dichotomy between the Middle Ages as an age of faith and then early modern Europe with the Enlightenment especially as an age of reason, and the Enlightenment has been referred to as an age of reason, is a false dichotomy. Because all the individuals I'll be talking about today were certainly convinced Christians. Maybe with one exception, maybe with Voltaire, but that's another issue. But there's a big distinction to make between being critical of the institutional church, the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, or what have you, which were all by this time, i.e. in the 17th and on into the 18th century, state churches, or in other words, functions and instruments of government. It's one thing to be critical of that, the institutionalization of religion and faith, and being critical of quote-unquote Christianity, whatever that might mean. There's no univocal understanding of Christianity when we look at it historically. And so the Enlightenment thinkers were, in general, very critical of institutionalized religion, but they were not critical of the fundamental aspects of Christianity, namely God, Jesus as the incarnation and savior of the world. But it's just, what does that mean and how do we understand it? They began to be more heterodox in that sense, and heterodoxy here is an in-between term between orthodoxy or right teaching and heresy or false teaching. It is like questionable. And a lot of them had questionable positions based on the institutionalized churches, whether it's Catholic, Anglican, or Lutheran, or Calvinistic, or whatever. And so there is this opposition that is real, but that is then made out to be an opposition between faith and reason. And that is a distinction that should not have been made because that warps our understanding of what was going on. Now it is, though, at this time, too, in the later 17th century, I believe in the 1680s and 90s, that we have people, for the first time, proclaiming themselves as atheists. Baron de Holbach is one, whom I will not be talking about today. And I should have had a separate slide on the rise of atheism, but that's just too expansive. This lecture is already pretty full, actually. But it's beginning to be possible to publicly declare yourself as an atheist, whereas previously it wasn't. Atheism, and the term atheist, was always an outgroup term. It was something that you used to refer to your enemies, and that goes all the way back to the Romans, who considered the Christians atheists because they did not believe in the Roman gods. They were atheistic without gods, without God. Now, they weren't obviously atheistic in the broader sense, but that was a term that was being used. The term atheism or atheist was used in the 16th century again to attack one's opponents. But it's only then in the later 17th century that it becomes a self-designation. I do not believe in God. Most of these thinkers were Christian, quote unquote, in the sense of being theists. They believed in God. And Alexander Pope's couplet with Newton is a great understanding of that. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. There's still that creator. But what happened with the scientific revolution and with Newton and the establishment of this new paradigm that I talked about in the previous lecture was the focus on what had always been there, namely secondary causation. God was still seen as the primary cause, but what God did was establish secondary causes that ran everything. I think I mentioned that the image was God as the giant clockmaker, which was a medieval image. And yet here it was like, so what did God do? He, at the time it was definitely he, just got the pendulum moving, and then everything else moved according to natural law, according to reason, based on secondary causation, all these secondary causes. And with Alexander Pope's quip, what we see is God as primary cause. And what did God do? God said, "Let Newton be." And everything was light. Light enlightenment. Newton described mathematically the universal laws of nature. Now, there had always been discussions about and tensions between various levels of law: divine law, and human law being civil law, customary law, and on we go, and ecclesiastical law. And what were the relationships between divine law, the law of God, and then human law of its various sorts? It was always an intention. And enlightenment, that just is radicalized in some ways. And we'll see if you look at the PowerPoints that one of the discussions I talk about is the radical enlightenment. We'll get to there when we do. So there's this tension between law as governing and what is the basis for human governing if we, in some ways, kick God out of the picture. If we say, okay, there is divine law, but what's the relationship between divine law and human law? Well, based on this emphasis on secondary causation, we don't really have to worry about divine law that much, even though they did, and I'll be talking about some of that, but rather human law. This will be seen as a crisis of authority they'll be talking about, because where is the ultimate authority? If it's not God, where is it? Is it the government? Well, it's not the government for the Enlightenment thinkers, really, but it became reason. I'll be talking more about this as well. Human reason, because there was a relationship between divine reason and human reason. Because if God did things, this is something I'll be talking about more when I talk about Leibniz shortly, or maybe not all that shortly, but later on in this lecture. God did things for a reason. And that reason, that rationality, is the same rationality that humans have, because of reason is independent of humans or God. Now, the problem is human reason is insufficient. We have a difficult time knowing the reasons, and we have to really work towards understanding the reasons. Whereas divine reason is perfect reason. But still, there's this connection. And we'll see that as we go through. But that is why, in some ways, if you want to refer to the Enlightenment as the age of reason, it is legitimate and historically descriptive if we see it as reason as the ultimate authority for human affairs, rather than faith. And that quote-unquote opposition, it works, because we should act based on reason, not based on belief or faith. That is the dichotomy. Now, the thing is, medieval thinkers would say more or less the same thing. They would say that that relationship between reason and faith is different than it was, or than it became with the Enlightenment. That there was not an opposition, there was an extension. And that reason can only take us so far, and then we need faith to complete it. That was Thomas Aquinas' view throughout. And so it gets very problematic When scholars or teachers, because often things get reduced in the complexities, the immense complexity, necessarily gets reduced for teaching purposes. And that is not just in high school or elementary school or what's taught out there, what's portrayed out there, which is certainly the case. But I'm even talking about my lecture today and also your textbook. We have to reduce things, the complexity, because the Enlightenment was a very complex movement, development, trend, whatever you want to call it. And the complexity of the thinkers, these are great mental giants that I'll be talking about today. Their works, some of whom wrote voluminously. To try to reduce that to a few statements is really doing them a disservice. In so many ways, all the figures I'll be talking about today, and they're not that many, and certainly there are many more important figures of the Enlightenment, thinkers of the Enlightenment that I'm not going to be talking about today. But even the ones that I am, to really understand what their positions were and what their thought was, we really need to read at least all of the works that I'll be talking about, and then a lot of their other works as well. There could be entire courses, and there's been certainly books written about all of them, and multiple books written about all of them. So we need to realize that to simplify and reduce warps necessarily. Just keep that in mind. I'm not sure what to do about it, but just keep that in mind. And how that applies to your exam coming up, I'll be talking about next week's lectures and the second lecture for week 5 in terms of preparing for the first midterm. But it is a problem with teaching as such. We can't avoid it. We could spend all of our lives studying John Locke. We could spend all of our lives and then some studying Leibniz or Voltaire. And we still might not get it right, so to speak. So I just hope you are aware of that problem and what's going on here. So what I'm presenting to you, and I'm not an expert in any of these thinkers that I'll be talking about. I've read some of their works, not all of their works, but I've read the works I'll be talking about today. And I've read other scholars' discussions of them and so. But it is a complex issue. And so what I'm attempting to do is to offer perspective based on the complexity and my awareness of the complexity. And I want you to be aware of that complexity as we go through to talk about this development of the Enlightenment. I mean, I have actually, in other contexts, made an analogy between the Enlightenment and today being woke today, or wokeism today. And in some ways, on the popular level, I'll be talking more about the impact of the Enlightenment in the next lecture a little bit. There can be, because it's the issue of, oh, are you enlightened? Oh, yeah, are you woke? Oh, I'm woke. What do you see? But these Enlightenment figures is far more complex than that. And there are not really great philosophical systems of wokeism, at least not yet, if that makes any sense. That's just an analogy to what was going on at the time. Because the Enlightenment, too, was not just these great minds, these great thinkers and authors. It did have an impact more broadly on society. And we'll be seeing that as we go along, too, a little bit today when we get towards the end of the lecture. We're talking about Rousseau and education. But then also next lecture talking about the social dynamics of the period of early modern Europe. So that is maybe a long preface, but it's also in terms for your final exam, which is, I think I said early on, is intended as a semester-long, a course-long project. It's where we really first see the origins and development of human rights as human rights, rights of individual human beings. And it's all then, too, based on reason. Now, we'll be looking at these as we go along, but that is kind of the context. that I want you to be aware of. We're talking about this enlightenment. There's no set date. Often people say it starts with Newton. Some people say it starts with Locke. Some people say it's just with Voltaire. It's been called, the enlightenment has been called not only the age of reason, but also the age of Voltaire. Um, so it is definitely an historical development, an historical trend that was of massive importance at the time and still is, because in so many ways we today are still the inheritors of the Enlightenment, whether that's we're aware of that or not, and even if it's in transformed and somewhat skewed and even warped views, we are inheritors of the Enlightenment. That's why this period is so important. So let's look at then some of the developments in a simplified, reduced form to see some of the impact that it had in terms of what was going on at the time. That being said, okay, we can move along then to human rights and the development of human rights. And for that, we do start with John Locke. John Locke was an English author. He was supported by a couple of noble men. That's the other thing about the Enlightenment. A lot of these enlightened thinkers were not, they were university trained, but were not members of the university. This is something, too, I'll say more about next lecture. They're members of royal societies. They were supported by princes or kings, with patrons, or the nobility. And so there is a broadening of intellectual interest, so to speak. And Locke was supported by a couple of different English noblemen. He is writing in the context of, number one, the Restoration in England, which you can read about in your textbook, I've talked about before, and then the Glorious Revolution. Once we have the end of the Protectorate with Oliver Cromwell, as I talked about last week, we have what's called the Restoration, the return of the monarchy, with Charles II and then with James II. But James II was seen as, again, too close to the Catholics. This is not right. We have to make sure that England is a Protestant nation, because even though this glorious revolution, even though we want to get rid of the Protectorate, so much of what Cromwell had done and so much of what had been fought for in the English Civil War, which I talked about, was seen as invalid. And it's almost seen that Cromwell had moved away from his promises originally and became more or less a tyrant. So with the Restoration, with James, it's like, oh my God, we have to get rid of him. We don't want another civil war. So they arranged to bring in William of Orange, a Dutch nobleman, and his wife Mary, to become king. It's called the Bloodless Revolution. They just kind of said, James, okay, you have to go. You have to be retired, exiled, and we're bringing in a new monarchy. And it's in that context, in that conflict, because even though it was called the Bloodless Revolution, okay, it was more or less, it was not an armed conflict that brought it about. It was not without contention, problems, upset. And in that context, Locke writes, he wrote a lot of things, but he writes his 2 treatises of government. Now, he had previously written something that's called an essay concerning understanding, human understanding. And he's famous here for saying that, that the human being is a blank slate at birth. This kind of comes from Aristotle. That everything we receive through our senses. Now, that is, again, the essay on human understanding is a very long, technical treatise. And there's no real way to do it justice in a short discussion. Now, the 2 treatises of government I have assigned before when I taught this course. it could be manageable. It's in two parts. The first is a refutation of patriarchy, and another Englishman, author Robert Filmer, wrote a book on patriarchy, arguing for the monarchy, and more of an absolute monarchy based on the concept of patriarchy. And Locke attacked that. So you can't appeal to God and Adam and the patriarchs of the Old Testament, so to speak, and then human families and the father figure of human families for understanding government. Here, Locke was, in this sense, developing something very new, because I have up here the feudal order, rights, privileges, and responsibilities in terms of rights, was one that was still somewhat there. We'll talk about more of this after the midterm, because it's not really until the French Revolution that that feudal structure legally was overturned, at least in France. But in England, there's always had been this attempt to limit the monarchy, or at least make the monarchy somewhat responsible to Parliament. Parliament as the legislature. And what Locke is arguing is that the government is the monarch, yes, but within the context of Parliament. Now, one of the readings for today, for this week, is the English Bill of Rights, which I'll be talking about after I talk about Locke. And we'll see how that kind of works together. But with Locke, he says, okay, you know what? It's not just about status and rights of the peasantry, rights and responsibilities, which I think I talked about, rights and responsibilities of the peasantry, of the nobility, of the clergy. And it's like, okay, as I think I said, all the peasant revolts of the 14th and later in the 15th century and on to the 16th century were not about individual rights and individual freedoms. It was about the traditional rights of peasants. As a class, as an order, the three orders, which I think I mentioned, the nobility certainly didn't refer to themselves, and the aristocracy didn't think of themselves as peasants. They were still peasants who worked in the fields. In some ways, that designation was there was being an increasing split between the aristocracy, the wealthy merchants, the landed gentry in England, and the nobility based still on blood and family traditions, and then the workers. And so the peasantry is really becoming what we more generally think of as peasants, which it was in the Middle Ages too, but that legal definition included everybody who was not noble by birth or a member of the clergy. So Locke did something that hadn't been done before. It wasn't based on the rights and privileges of your class or your status. He based it on individuals. Now, there are the two treatises of government, and Locke's new point of departure, the individual, because he claims that every individual has the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, if you read Locke, especially within the historical context, even though he claims that that's what is a basic human right of life, liberty, and property, he doesn't really mean all individuals, and he doesn't say that. And we'll see this after the midterm, when we talk about the French Revolution and the American Revolution, with Thomas Jefferson, who had studied Locke. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, says all men are created equal, and inherent, unalienable rights of life, liberty, and happiness. Even though that was basically meant for Jefferson, free white property-holding males. That's what it still meant for Locke. Women were not included, children were not included, indentured servants weren't included, and slaves were not included. The slave trade is still going on at this time. So Locke is not really meaning every human being. What he's meaning is every propertied male has a right to property, life, and liberty, and the government cannot take that away. We still have a long way to go before we get to universal human rights. But with Locke, it's not simply the rights of the nobility or even of the aristocracy. It's the rights of individual members of those classes. And the government cannot impinge upon those rights. And we'll see that. We saw that in some ways last week in the English Petition of Right. And we'll see that again when we talk about the English Bill of Rights. There's this issue of countering the government. So individual rights with Locke stand over against government abuse of their power and authority. And that gets back to the social contract, because Locke, too, had a concept of the social contract, but very different from Hobbes. So I talked about Hobbes when I was talking about English absolutism. For Hobbes, in the state of nature, life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short, survival of the fittest. Not a place anybody would really want to live unless you think you are the fittest. And then either you are or you die. So it's like, okay, for Hobbes, we form a social contract to preserve ourselves for self-preservation, and we give up our individual sovereignty to the state, to the government, to the Leviathan. And once we do that, we can never get it back. That was Hobbes. Now, the term sovereignty is important here because in some ways that is the right of life, liberty, and property. Sovereignty is the right to determine for yourself what to do and how to live. To be a sovereign. Sovereignty over yourself. Am I free to be a sovereign over myself? Because a slave is not sovereign. Slave is being dictated to. So that concept of sovereignty kind of encapsulates all of that. Now with Locke, the state of nature was not nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Why? Because humans in a state of nature are rational people, for the most part. And in a state of nature, things would go very well indeed, with one exception. There are those individuals who are corrupt, who would try to gain an advantage for themselves, whereby they would infringe upon the rights of other individuals by stealing, by theft, by violence, what have you. But for Locke, that's the minority. But it's a danger because humans, we are fallen, sinful creatures. That too is Locke's understanding. And there needs to be a guard against, let's say, the abuse of individual sovereignty. That, for Locke, was the reason the social contract was formed and established, was to provide for a common defense, a common police force, let's say. Because if we allowed everybody to be a police for their own selves, then that's just the same as, every man for himself, or every man for himself, not at the time, meaning I'm not being, they weren't being inclusive, and so I'm not meaning to exclude every individual. But it'd be the same thing as in the state of nature. And so it's a problem. So if we establish a government to punish and refrain the abuse of individual sovereignty for the common good, for the collective, that is really the function of government, to preserve the rights of life, liberty, and property for those individual white male property owning individuals against potential and or actual attempts by criminals, i.e. those who seek to assert their own sovereignty at the disadvantage of others, whether it's by theft or violence or what have you. Now that giving up of your sovereignty for Locke was also very different from Hobbes. Because for Hobbes, it was once you give up your sovereignty to the Leviathan, you can never get it back. For Locke, it's like, no, because what is the purpose of government for Locke? The purpose of government for Locke was to ensure the rights of life, liberty, and property. If the government itself becomes a criminal, becomes a tyrant, and impinges upon those rights, the citizens, i.e., property white males, have the right to take their sovereignty back and to overthrow the government, to establish a new government that will recognize and support and defend those rights. So we have rights up here that are independent. Now, Locke doesn't say unalienable, but that are independent of the government, that are based on the state of nature. The state of nature, we have these rights. The problem is there are people who abuse their own sovereignty to try to impinge upon others' rights. And so we form a government. Now, if the government starts doing that themselves, it's up to the citizens to dissolve the government and establish a new one. That's what we saw in the Glorious Revolution. That's what they did. They said, okay, Parliament said we got together. Parliament said, okay, the monarch is abusing our rights. We need to make a change. And they did so. And they got rid of James II and brought in William and Mary. And by the way, this is the same William and Mary as the University on the East Coast, William and Mary. So that is what was going on there. And William had to ensure that he would govern based on supporting the rights of life, liberty, and property for the property-owning, free, white males. And that brings us to the English Bill of Rights. Now, I already mentioned about the Glorious Revolution. The English Bill of Rights is the reading for this week. And when you read it, ask yourself what is really going on here. It talks a lot about Parliament, and it talks about Parliament and how it is illegal for the monarch to usurp the rights of Parliament or to act in contradiction to the rights of Parliament, to impose taxes without Parliament's consent. Here in the background, no taxation without representation. That was what was going on. They can't impose taxes without the consent of the governed. They can't claim that citizens have to house troops without their own consent. They can't take away the rights of Parliament to speak their minds, free speech, or to own weapons. At least if you're Protestant, because that was one of the issues with James trying to say, okay, we know these Protestants are, a threat to my kind of Catholic attempted rule. So let's get rid of their ability to resist militarily, as what happened in the Civil War. And here everybody's saying, no, they can't do that. The formulation, as you will see, of these rights are all in statements of what is illegal, that it's illegal for the monarch to act without the consent of Parliament. That's what kind of comes down to. So this gets back to the question of what is a right and who are the rights for? For whom are the rights? Are there unalienable rights or what is legal? And that is going to be a tension that we still see on into today. What is the basis of human rights? Is it because we are just human? If we want to look at today, okay, if we have the rights of the Bill of Rights, what does that really mean? Can there be any limits on them at all? Are there limits on the freedom of speech, or can we say whatever we want in whatever context we want? Is hate speech allowed? Is standing up in a crowded theater and yelling fire when we know there's no fire, just to see the chaos that might ensue? Is that legal? What is free speech? Just for one, what does it mean that we have the right to bear arms? Does it mean we can have tanks or fighter planes in our backyard? Well, those are arms. Well, no, if we can't have those, what can we have? Can we have, AK-47s? Well, yeah, those are okay. Tanks are a bit much. Grenades might be a bit much, but AK-47s, assault rifles, those are all just fine and dandy. Where's that line drawn? Now, I'm just pointing out some of the problems with the issue of that right. Does it mean that we can have no background checks? Is that an infringement upon the right to bear arms? All these questions that are currently being debated were already being debated in the context of the English Bill of Rights. And then on, as we will see in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Bill of Rights. What does it all mean? And who grants us rights? Do we have rights just because we're human beings? And if so, if those are not being recognized, what do? Do slaves have rights? Well, that all depends on whether or not they're human beings. If they're human beings, then they have rights, and then slavery cannot be seen as legal. Are the laws, i.e., that which is legal, based upon rights, or are the laws what grant us rights? In the English Bill of Rights, we see it's all illegal, which means if it's based on law, can laws be changed? And then would it be legal? And then would it be a right granted by the government? All these things are problematic. And if we appeal to the divine, to divine law, then the problem is, what do we do with that? And how do we know what it is? Religion is a problem because we can't analyze the text. We can analyze the text of the scriptures, but we can't say that that is definitely what, quote unquote, God, quote unquote, wrote. Still, at this time, there's no such thing as fundamentalism in terms that the Bible is literally true. That becomes word for word true. That is a later development, basically. But the problem is, do we appeal to divine law? Do we appeal to human law? And if we're talking about individual human rights, the state of nature, what does that mean? Now, neither Hobbes nor Locke, in terms of the state of nature, went back to Eden. Nor did either of them say that the state of nature was an actual historical state of existence. It was a mental, theoretical construct. But what do we do about it? How do we deal with the problems and the issues? Rather difficult. That brings us to then the realization that the only way we can somehow balance this issue of human rights based on what is legal, that just goes to the government, or based on divine law, but that gets really a problem, especially when there's different interpretations, which you've seen all along. And they knew very well, too, not only in terms of Protestant Catholics within England, but within the whole Reformation problem. You can't say simply that there is one clear divine law, because that was the whole basis for the civil wars in the empire, for the civil wars in France, for the civil war in England. Conflict over what divine law actually was when it is implemented in human terms. So it's like we can't appeal to that anymore. That's what we get with Hobbes saying, okay, it's your freedom of conscience. You can believe what you want, but you have to follow the state religion as one solution. The idea of individual right to religion, belief, became basically part of the Enlightenment. And they said, okay, yeah, fine, be pious, but a deist position is still there. Or then increasingly, an atheist position. So religion, in some ways, we factor out of the equation. We can't appeal to religion for rights, for human rights, for individual rights, for what is legal, for what is not legal. And they say, well, wait a minute, doesn't Jefferson appeal to religious concepts when he says all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property? That's not a religious statement. That's a typical Enlightenment theist statement of God as creator, and then everything works by secondary causes, by natural law. Physical law, natural law, which we know from Newton. But then we can apply that to society as a whole, because it's rational and it's reason. And it's understanding that use of reason as opposed to appealing to divine authority or state authority. I mean, governmental authority, whether that be a monarchy, a protectorate in England, or a republic, or what have you. It says we can appeal to reason as the ultimate authority because if God, gets with Leibniz, as I'll talk about shortly, if God does things, created things, guides things, God did so with a reason. And it's that same reason that we can try to perceive if we use our own reason, because reason is reason. It's just God reasons more perfectly. And that use of reason becomes almost the definition of the Enlightenment. And here we have reason, rationality, and reasoning. We have Immanuel Kant's definition of enlightenment in his essay of 1784, What is Enlightenment? I'm just going to read this to you, but it's there for you to go back and look at and ponder more. Enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Self-incurred is this tutelage when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Sapere aude, which here they have translated as have courage to use your own reason, really is like dare to seek wisdom, to grasp, to understand. But have the courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of enlightenment. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great a portion of mankind, after nature has long since discharged them from external direction, nevertheless remains under lifelong tutelage, and why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as their guardians. It is so easy not to be of age. If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, and so forth, I need not trouble myself. I need not think if I can only pay. Others will easily undertake this irksome work for me. And Kant goes on to say, that we are not in an age of enlightenment. We are in an age pursuing enlightenment. Let's look at his argument there, though. And what does he mean by reason? Because it's difficult and was not a given. And that's one of the problems with reason, as we will see. I have up here then on the slide reason as faculty. That goes back to the medieval understanding that the faculty of the soul was reason as part of the intellect. Reason, will, those are the two basic faculties and emotions, but those we call the lower powers of the will. The higher functions or functions of the will, or components of the will, were intellect and will. What's the relationship between intellect or reason and will? So it's the capacity of humans to have reason. That was one use of it. But then we have reasoning. And here I have their reasoning as logic. Now, I said already with Newton, there were rules of logic. Every human being, supposedly, in this view, has the same faculty of reason. But then there's the use of reason or reasoning. And there are universal rules for reasoning. Logic is one. That goes back to Aristotle still, even though by this time Aristotle, in so many ways, is being continuously overturned, especially his natural philosophy. But his logic still is very much seen as valid for the most part. Even though there are progressions that have been made and developments along the way, also medieval developments in logic. But if we can establish these universally applicable rules of reason that we call logic, that is independent of individual reasoning and individuals' understanding of those universal rules. Same thing with mathematics. There are universal rules of mathematics, which doesn't mean that every individual knows all the rules of mathematics by any means, but they're kind of out there based on reason that are theoretically in any way graspable. And this external reason is the same for God and for humans, because God acts rationally. Humans are rational beings, at least by capacity, theoretically, even if we are, fallen creatures, or at least creatures that don't have the same perspective as God. We're not divine beings, we're human temporal beings. So we can't really know God's reasons, but we can get really close because the reason is the same. Now, rationality then is what is rational based on reasoning, logic, and mathematics. And in reasoning, the reason is based on knowledge and evidence. There has to be a reason for things, and it has to be able to be defended, either logically or based on evidence. And that gets back to Kant's quotation there. If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, and so forth, I need not trouble myself. I need not think. If I can only pay, others will easily undertake the irksome work for me. Do we need doctors? Well, if we take just this little snippet out of Kant's treatise and look at it, his definition of enlightenment, but no, all we have to do is think for ourselves. Something is wrong with me. What is it? I can think for myself. We don't need teachers. We don't need education. Because what is education? Having someone else tell you the way things are. It is tutelage. And if we then eventually move beyond our period of tutelage, then we become independent. What Kant does not include there is the extent to which that tutelage affects our independence. It's like all of a sudden we get to a certain stage and then boom, we can go and play by ourselves, without realizing that what we're taught along the way affects that quote unquote independence once we quote unquote become independent. So I'm going to say, okay, the age of 18, we reach our majority in this country. Children become adults at the age of 18. Does that mean an 18-year-old all of a sudden is independent and just has to think for him or her or itself without the effect of its tutelage? How it was reared, what it was taught, what its background was? And if I am then independent and I just have to think for myself, if I make a statement that, that aliens have come down to Earth and helped build the pyramids and everything else, it makes sense. I could argue for it. There could be reasons for it. Where's the evidence? Do I need evidence? Or can I just argue what I think because I am daring to use my reason? That's one of the problems that we find ourselves in our society today. Alternative facts, the issue of, disinformation, the dismissal of evidence, conspiracy theories. What's the evidence? How do we know? Can there be debate about evidence? Of course there can be debate about evidence. That's what historians do. That's what all scholars do. We debate the evidence. But if someone comes along and says that's not evidence, that's a whole different level. Whole different level. So it is not, therefore, reason and our use of reason necessarily based on knowledge, expertise, and evidence. If I have, a pain in my gut that is really hurting really badly, and let's say I'm throwing up or something, do I analyze that myself and say, well, I can think, I know what's wrong. Yeah, I know what's wrong. I have pain and I'm throwing up. What do I do about it? I don't know. I go seek the help of a doctor, because doctors know. Expert knowledge is important, and that is what is not included in that quotation from Kant. We can't just sit back and think. It's based on our tutelage. Our whole understanding, our whole ability to think and to know is based on our tutelage, our upbringing, our education. And the appeal to reason independently of that, as Kant does in this statement. Now, Kant is a brilliant mind, or was a brilliant mind. And this is, not really being fair to him because I'm taking one little definition out of context and then using it to critique the position of reason. And I'm aware of that, and you should be too. Don't go off and say, because I'm about ready to talk about the irrationality of the Enlightenment, that Kant was irrational. I'm not saying that at all. But he really does analyze the use of reason. He wrote his 3 famous treatises: The Critique of Pure Reason, The Critique of Practical Reason, and The Critique of Judgment. So he's using reason to critique erroneous in his views of reason. So he's a brilliant mind and one of the major philosophical figures of modernity and early and everything else. But I just want to point out this problem. We can't just think. We have to have knowledge. We have to have learning. We have to have experience and understanding. And we have to base all that on evidence. And in this definition of enlightenment that Kant does give, that's not included. The Enlightenment was not just thinking. It was not simply dare to use your reason. It was to evaluate what you're being told, to analyze. If society tells you we need to, we need to increase the taxes to go and start a major war at the same time against China, North Korea, and Iran, once and for all. Let's get rid of them. That's the problem. That could seem rational. There are enemies. They, are against us. Let's just go get rid of them. That'd be the rational thing to do in many ways. But would that course of action be practical? Would it lead to our end? Is it rational, whereby the precepts would lead to the desired consequences and outcomes? We have the state where we are, we have the desired outcome, but this bridge is lacking in reason, even if we exclude that bridge and say these people are our enemies, we are here, we need to get rid of that will make us safer. Great. So how do we go about doing that? Let's go bomb them. That's the problem. We have to stop and analyze. Stop and analyze. Think about it. Is that the case? Does it make sense to say I'm not going to get a COVID vaccine because the government is, actually injecting trackers into me? Think about it for a minute. Do you have a phone? The government can already track you if you have a phone everywhere. It makes no sense. They can already do what you're accusing them of trying to do. Things like that. And how can you stand up and say against all the health professionals, the experts, that you know better? Now, it's one thing to say I am against vaccines because of my views of artificial health care is against my religious beliefs, my philosophical beliefs, or whatever. Therefore, I'm not going to accept this. That's one thing. You can take that position. I would say I think you're wrong, but you can take that position. That would be a rational position to take because you're thinking for yourself. You're not denying all the evidence and denying expert knowledge. But to say that the vaccine is dangerous, to say that it's a government plot, that is conspiracy, and that is saying that you know better than the experts. You know what? We don't. My expert knowledge is in a very small area. Now, within that small area, I have a very high degree of expert knowledge, one of the world's leading experts. Outside that, I'm not. And I know that. If I start pretending that I'm an expert in everything, I'm just a complete pompous ass. We rely on expert knowledge. We rely on our tutelage, both previous to our coming into our majority or independence or freedom to think for ourselves, as well as in afterwards based on our understanding. Can I do everything that I might need or want to do based on my thinking? Say absolutely not. And that gets at the irrationality of the Enlightenment because it puts reason against reason and makes rational based on what I think is rational. And it's this conflict between individual rationality and this projected, assumed reason that has become the new authority, displacing God and or religion or institutionalized religion. Fine. Get rid of institutionalized religion, or at least don't think just don't accept what your pastors are telling you, says Kant. Agree, because some of those pastors may be idiots, not well educated, and spout off stuff that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So reason, analyze. But if you place reason as this new authority, what does that really mean for the individual? Because aren't you saying simply that your view of reason is the absolute external reason? Because what if there's a disagreement? What if reason contradicts reason or conflicts with reason? How is that resolved? It's a problem. Well, with mathematics and logic, it can because there are external rules. If it's arguing using your reason about courses of action, about morality, about what do we do, about politics, where is that absolute authority? Especially if we don't appeal to God. That's my reason against yours. Anyway, I am writing a couple of different projects dealing with this problem, this issue. But here, that's what's going on here, the conflict that was inherent therein. Now, if, though, we look at reason and the attempt to construct a whole system based on reason, we end up or can end up with everything that is the best of all possible worlds. And that is something that we turn next to. In the next slide, the best of all possible worlds, because that was the argument of Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, a German scholar, wrote voluminously. I only mentioned up there two of his treatises, his Discourse on Metaphysics of 1686, and then his treatise, much longer treatise, Theodicy of 1710. Leibniz was brilliant. He's been called the last universal genius. Diderot, by the way, you'll read about Diderot in the textbook, one of the founders and authors of the Encyclopédie in France, was seen one of the greatest projects of the Enlightenment. And so Diderot, an author, a literary person, referred to Leibniz as this great thinker, equated him in terms of importance with Plato. So when you read Leibniz, it makes you want to just throw away all of your writings and burn them and go, hide in a corner and never come out again. Because he had that much impact and was that impressive of a scholar. There was debates whether Leibniz developed calculus first and then Newton. There was conflicts at the time over the priority, and scholars today basically say that they both developed calculus independently. Newton, though, probably did it first, even though Leibniz published on it first. And so there's this conflict that was going on there. And Leibniz, based on this concept of reason, a mathematical certitude, argued as follows. God is rational because God would not do something without a reason. If God has a choice between A or B, if God chooses B, that's not because he's just being capricious. He's not simply saying, oh, I feel like B today. He has a reason for choosing B. And that reason is what we really need to see, because if it's divine reason, it's the best possible reason. Not because necessarily, theoretically, there couldn't be something better, but it's the best reason and best choice of possible choices. So he says it's the best possible world. It means practically, overall, given the whole, God has chosen to do that which is best. Not necessarily for individuals, but overall. And there's a reason for it, even if we can't discern those reasons. There is a reason for it, because reason is there, same as our reason, and we can reason up to it and get close to it. That's our goal and our task, to understand the reasons behind what God actually does. That leads to this view that everything that is a product of divine reason. That's what the theodicy is about, but even the metaphysics starts off with that premise. Because of reason and perfection, everything is theoretically perfected or perfect, because God would not create imperfection. God's the most perfect being that there is, has reasons for doing whatever, even though in practicality we don't act perfectly, we don't think perfectly. So we are at a disadvantage because we're in a state of not being able to realize our perfection and not being able to rationally get to the ultimate reasons behind all that God has done. But God governs everything. Everything that happens has a divine reason behind it. It's a theoretical construct. And it was seen as an attempt to describe mathematically and logically all of human society and actions. Because if we can do that with math and logic, we can do that with, as I said, with human actions. Therefore, there's a reason, a divine reason for everything. Now, Leibniz is fantastic. I think there are problems. For me, I mentioned the things that I'm writing with this problem and issue, is the equation of reason, divine reason with human reason, or reason as an abstract external authority that God adheres to and that humans adhere to. Therefore, blah, 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 blah. But that's another issue. But it also led to critique. And here I have Voltaire, because Voltaire, as I've already mentioned, who wrote voluminously, critiqued the Leibniz position and did so in his great work, Candide, written in 1759. Candide is rather short. I've also often assigned Candide as one of the texts, the whole thing. I thought about it again, because as I said, it is relatively short, but decided not to, because I wanted to have more texts rather than just a few more extensive texts, if that makes sense. But anyway, it is a satire. It's a satire on the entire Enlightenment views and ideas expressed by Leibniz, but all the way through. Now, as you can see with the dates, Voltaire is writing before Kant. He has all kinds of quotable quotes, and one of his quotable quotes was, "If God does not exist, it would be necessary to invent him," because he sees divinity, theist position, as necessary for society. And so Voltaire has been misused, misunderstood. He bounced around. He was at the court of Frederick of Prussia, one of the almost epitomized enlightened monarchs at the time. But two tragedies happened in his life. Or in his life, one, his mistress died. And then in 1753, there was the earthquake in Lisbon in Spain, which killed hundreds of people. And that shook Voltaire. How can this be the best happening that there could be? How could this be divine will? And Candide has the subtitle of the Optimist. I'm just going to check it here because I have it here. Oh gosh, where is this? Because the Paradoxes of Voltaire. Sorry, it's just called Candide, but in the published version, it's on optimism or something. Because the optimistic view is that of Leibniz, that everything works for the best because there's a divine reason. So it's called Candide or on optimism. And the figure that Candide constructed of Dr. Pangloss, or Pangloss, Panglos, is a caricature of Leibniz. And it's about this young man, Candide, who's the nephew. It's a little bit unclear if it's the nephew or son of this baron with the baron's daughter. So it's not really his son, maybe adopted son, but nephew more likely, even though early on it's kind of ambiguous. But the baron sees that Candide and his daughter are falling in love. It's like, oh my God. So he sends them off. Now, before he sends Candide off and everything, he has a tutor for both Candide and his daughter. That is Dr. Pangloss, whose whole point was that everything works for the best. Why do we have noses? To hold up our spectacles. There's a reason behind everything. That's that optimistic view. It's the best of all possible worlds. Things couldn't be better. There's a reason behind everything that works, and it all works for the good. Now, making that very short, or paraphrasing it very short, the Baron's daughter goes off Kunigunde, and is captured by pirates, and Candide is captured. I mean, they suffer all of these horrible, horrible tragedies. They finally end up in Turkey on a farm. It is Candide, Pangloss, and Kunigunde, with some other characters that they pick up along the way. And Pangloss is still upholding his view of the best of all possible worlds. And Candide, after being through all these horrors, being tortured and everything else, they're on this farm. It's like a peaceful farm. Let's live a life, forget what's going on in the world. Let's just live on our farm in peace and enjoy life the best we can. Now, that's what is going on. So while returning to his farm, Candide reflected deeply on the Turk's words. And he said to Pangloss and Martin, "That kindly old man seems to have made a better life than the 6 kings we had the honor of eating supper with." "Power and glory," said Pangloss, "are very dangerous, as all philosophers tell us. For indeed, Eglon, king of the Moabites, was assassinated by Ehud. Absalom was hanged by his hair and preceded by 3 spears. King Nadab, son of Jeroboam, was killed by Baasha. King Elah of Zimri, Haziah by Jehu, Athaliah by Jeroboam, and on it goes. All these people, kings being killed. The Emperor Henry IV, I know, said Candide, that we must cultivate our garden. Meaning we just must farm our farm. "You're right," said Pangloss. "For when man was placed in the Garden of Eden, he was placed there so that he would work it, in order to work on it, which proves that humankind was not made for rest." "Let us work without theorizing," said Martin, one of the colleagues they picked up along the way. "That is the only way to make life bearable." The little society entered into this laudable plan. Each began to exercise his talents. The little bit of earth became productive. Kunigunde was undeniably very ugly, but she baked excellent pastries. Paquette embroidered. The old woman took care of the linen. No one failed to contribute, not even brother Giroflée. He was a very good carpenter and even became a sociable fellow. Sometimes Pangloss would say to Candide, "All events are linked together in the best of all possible worlds." For after all, if you had not been driven from a fine castle with great kicks in the behind for loving Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been seized by the Inquisition, if you had not crossed South America on foot, if you had not thrust a sword into the Baron, if you had not lost your sheep from the good county of El Dorado, you would not be here eating candied citrons and pistachios. That is well said, replied Candide, but we must cultivate our garden. Living without theorizing. That was a point. Just do what we do. Let's not stop thinking about it. Let's stop wondering and worrying about it. Let's just live our lives the best we can here. That was Candide's point, and that was Voltaire's point against this optimism of Leibniz that everything works for the best. Now, Leibniz was not Pangloss. Pangloss is a caricature of Leibniz. But that idea of everything working towards the best, not that it's all best for everybody, but in terms of the best divine reason, and that's why it all happens, is for some divine reason that was certainly there. Now, this positive attitude, this optimism, this relishing in reason that Voltaire critiques, because what was the reason all of that happened to Candide? What was the reason of the Lisbon earthquake that killed people? Was also a part of this enlightenment. Even though there still was this focus on the good and the positive. And that brings me then to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You can see up there. And Rousseau, in some ways, here almost takes the opposite view to Kant, in some ways, in terms of education and quote-unquote tutelage, which I already mentioned when I'm talking about that passage in Kant, which I said was being unfair to Kant, but that passage as such. And Rousseau, too, was a major figure of the Enlightenment, and a controversial figure, because he even went further to critique some of the established norms, even the theistic norms. And his book on the social contract starts out with the phrase, one of the most famous lines from the Enlightenment: man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One believes himself the other's master, and yet is more a slave than they. You can say, well, that sounds just like Kant, and in some ways it does. That's just kind of this point of departure. But he says, what do we do about it? We can get there, but it's based on education. Now, I'm going to be really abbreviating this too, because I see that my set time of an hour and 15 minutes for a lecture, which would be the time given for an in-class lecture, is running almost out. But I will try to make up. If I run a little bit over, my apologies. I'll try to make up next week, certainly, with 2 shorter lectures. But here we have Rousseau in his book, The Social Contract, and he wrote many other things too, which I'll get to. At least one of his other works, Emile, published in the same year, 1672. He argues about right and law, and what is the difference between a right and a law. And in the state of nature for Rousseau, human beings, man again, human beings, man, are born free and rational. The problem is we are not all sufficient to ourselves. So we need to see, okay, how do we put this all together? How do we get more of what we want, self-interest? We form a collective, the social contract, whereby the common good is established. We give up some of our sovereignty to the common good. And that common good that has a general will, as he refers to it, that will lead to the best outcome for everybody in some ways. And the problem of being in chains is that we don't realize the function of government and what the state of nature actually is. We think it's something else. We're actually good, free people, so we need to get back to that state of nature. And that is the purpose of government, is kind of like with Locke, to restrain criminals. For Rousseau, it's really to bring about a return to the state of nature based on the common good and the general will, even though there are still tensions between what is a right, what is a law, what are different aspects of rights and what are different aspects of law. And if we only can understand how society works, in Rousseau's view, we could all be at peace and live in harmony, kind of, in the best of all possible worlds, sort of, almost. And that is where education comes in. And in 1762, in the same year he wrote, or published the Social Contract, he wrote his novel called Emile. Its novel is it's beginning to be a novel. The novel as a literary form is just beginning to come about. Whether Emile is a novel or not is not a major issue, but it's a work of fiction, but with a point. In Emile, it's about the education. And Rousseau considered it his most important work because it says if we can educate our children, ourselves, in the proper way, that will lead to the goodness of society as a whole. Rousseau became a very important figure for, as we'll talk about later, see later, 19th century Romanticism. He became very important for educational theory about how do we go about teaching, what do we teach, how do we do it, because the issue then too is authority. That critique of Kant in terms of the tutelage was for Kant a negative that enslaved us, whereas for Rousseau, the tutelage, if done rightly, education, was freeing. It's what freed us and made us possible to return to a state of nature. Because the problem is, the state of nature is not a theoretical beginning point, because we find ourselves already afterwards, and the social contract is formed after the state of nature, because the state of nature is what we need to get back to. That is what it's all about with Rousseau. Yeah. The radical enlightenment. Rousseau was radical, Kant less so. Voltaire can be seen as radical. There's a book, Jonathan Israeli, called The Radical Enlightenment Philosophy. It's a big, thick, fat book published by Oxford a number of years ago that points out that there are radical elements within the Enlightenment and then less radical elements. And we have to see it as such, so that we have, let's say, Enlightenment figures against Enlightenment figures. We have conflict, we have debate, we have problems. And that is what we're really getting at, is where is authority? That's why I have up there the crisis of authority, because that is really what made the Enlightenment radical, is it questioned authority. I don't know if this is, I'm sure, showing my age, going back to, the 70s or maybe even the 60s, or maybe not to the 80s. I kind of get all those decades mixed up. But there was a bumper sticker that said, question authority. It's like, absolutely, question authority. Yes. How can we do without authority? Are we our own authority? Is the government the authority? Is God the authority? Is the institutionalized religion the authority? That's what we're all getting at. And that's what was behind Kant's statement, too. Think and analyze what you consider to be authoritative and why. If we look at the Enlightenment as the search for authority based on analysis, based on reason, rather than what was given to us in terms of the church or to the state or whatever, then certainly it is a radical revolutionary moment. Locke's idea of individual human rights, standing up against and opposed to government incursions, is a radical idea. The idea that we can stand up for ourselves and say no, because I have the authority to do that. But if we start asserting individual authority, Where does that lead us? Does not that lead us back eventually to a Hobbesian state of nature where everyone is a sovereign in and of themselves, and it's the power of the survival of the fittest and the strongest? Don't we need authority to temper that? How do we handle that problem, the problem of authority? We still haven't figured it out. But that was really what the Enlightenment was about, intellectually, religiously, politically, was questioning the authority and struggling to come up with this alternative to traditional structures of authority. And what they came up with, they writ large, was reason, abstract reason. But as I put up here on the sign, the new orthodoxy in terms of reason was based on a belief in reason, the faith that there was such a thing as reason, beyond the capacity for individuals to rationalize. But this logic and mathematics, no problem. But when we get to some abstract reason that serves as the authority, what difference is that in terms of belief and faith and saying, I believe in God, or I believe in abstract reason? Same thing. Or I believe in government, or I believe in what the Anglican Church teaches, or I believe what my teacher in third grade told me. Question authority is essential. But if we don't see it in context of needing to realize that if we establish our own selves as God, we still have a problem. It may be freeing and wonderful. What does it mean to be free? If I proclaim my own sovereignty, that's great. But if we look at it, neither Hobbes nor Locke nor Rousseau argued for individual sovereignty unchecked. They were all saying maybe that might be okay. I mean, for Hobbes, definitely not, because humans are nasty and life is brutish, short, and terrible. But for Locke and then Rousseau, natural sovereignty could be great. The state of nature could be wonderful. But there are people or governments that will impinge upon that. And that's why with Locke, we need government to allow individual sovereignty, freedom, liberty, property, to ensure individual rights. With Rousseau, we need the government as a general will to bring all of society back to a state of nature of freedom and individual sovereignty. What is right? What is wrong? What was the solution? Obviously, none of these grand ideas worked out, because what we ended up with in the context of this age of enlightenment, or the age of Voltaire, age of individualism, age of reason, was the age of revolution. American Revolution, French Revolution, which led to then Napoleon, who was emperor. That will be the story after the midterm, when we see the transition from early modern Europe to modern Europe. For now, we need to say, okay, what was the relationship between individual and society? How did that work out for the various theoreticians, philosophers? Or is the solution Voltaire's of Candide and Martin that says we should just go about our business without theorizing? If we start theorizing, i.e., philosophizing, speculating, thinking about it, questioning things get all messed up. So let's just close our minds and go about our business in peace. Is that an option? Now, on their farm in Turkey, it may have been. For some people, it may have been. That's almost the monastic ideal come back in secular form. Can we do that as a whole? How do we handle that? That is the challenge of the Enlightenment. It's not the reason challenging faith and belief. It is the belief and faith in reason to figure out how do individuals in society relate. And it's a challenge that we still have not figured out today. And maybe some ways that is the real importance and impact of the Enlightenment. Okay. Next week, we'll put it in a broader perspective, socially, political context, the Enlightenment, and then have a lecture review session preparing for the midterm. That I think you will definitely want to pay attention to, because I'll be going through the midterm. I'll be talking about how to approach it, things that you should include and not. And I think also, just even though I'm over time today, I think both of those lectures next week will be shorter lectures, I promise. So there we are now. We'll get ready for one more substantive lecture next week, and then preparing for the midterm. We go from there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.